Hello and welcome back to this two-part series on the brain for AP Psychology in Unit 2 on biological basis. If you didn't catch the first part of the brain notes, you definitely need to make sure that you watch that first. In this second part, we're going to be talking about even bigger and better things, really, as to do with the brain. Okay, so in this section, we'll discuss the higher functioning area of the brain, which is that cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that sets us apart from all other species on Earth. So if you haven't yet, make sure you go to the link below this video where you're watching, and you'll see a link to my Teachers Pay Teacher store where you can grab the notes that go right along with this video or these slides. And let's get to it. So let's talk first about the cerebral cortex versus the cerebrum, because you will see both terms. And really, I talk about them kind of interchangeably, but I think it's important for you to know what they are separately because you're going to see them both. But just know that I normally talk about, and really on the test and in neuroscience in general, it's normally the cerebral cortex that's being talked about. The cerebral cortex is the outermost, very thin layer of what is the cerebrum, the thicker part, and the most prominent part of the brain. So the cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter that covers the inner white matter of the cerebrum. The gray matter is seen as being more complex, more useful, able to do more things, if that makes sense. Whereas white matter is just kind of like filler, pretty sure. The cerebral cortex is responsible for most of the sophisticated information processing of the brain. I'm actually going to go back to an image that is in the last set of notes, and I want to show you something here. So you see this lighter color stuff, right? That is really the cerebrum. Like inside of that, in the center of that is the cerebrum, the white matter that's kind of like filling it out. Then on the outside of it, the very outermost layer is the cerebral cortex. And you can't really see it all that well here. Just know that it's like the outermost layer that really gets in there and in the grooves and everything is the cerebral cortex. Now, this image shows you really everything about the cerebral cortex that we're going to be talking about. Now, we are going to get into the nitty-gritty here. What I first want you to do is watch this video. So you can actually purchase these slides on my Teachers Pay Teacher store, and you can find this video on YouTube. So you could also just look for it. But I just went on YouTube and researched and looked up cerebral cortex, and you'll find tons of interesting stuff. I just like how this guy kind of writes it out and draws for you. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is the frontal lobe. Okay, so just let me give you a landmark here. See this little brown guy in the back? It looks like a mini brain. That's because it's actually called the little brain. The cerebellum, you've got two of them in the back of your head there, are called the little brain because they look like little brains. Okay, so this back part here in the center of the slide is the back of your brain. So then the front up here is your frontal lobe, okay? It is also called the prefrontal cortex, and it controls some pretty major stuff. In fact, really, this is the part that is the last one to develop in brain development. So this is why if you're a teenager watching this right now, your frontal lobe has not fully developed yet and won't until you're about the age of 25. So if you find that you are not very good at any of these things that we talk about, that's why. It's development. Just give it time. So it controls functions like judgment, planning, producing speech sounds, controlling emotions, because your frontal lobe, and I want you to write this down, censors your amygdala, right? So your amygdala is what controls your extreme behaviors. And you might want to turn back in your old notes and write that down. Your amygdala controls extreme fear and aggressive behaviors. So if you don't have a frontal lobe that censors that thing, you're going to be all kinds of scared and aggressive, right? The frontal lobe also controls personality, temperament, and movement with what is the motor cortex, okay? So here's how I help my students remember this. Ever watch The Simpsons? You probably know Homer, right? Where he goes, "Don't," and he kind of hits his forehead. Well, that's because he's made a bad choice, right? Well, judgment, and choices are all controlled in the frontal lobe there, right? Including future planning as well. Okay, so then at the back of that, imagine you're wearing a headband. It's still in the frontal lobe, but at the back of it is what is the somatomotor, or just motor cortex. Okay, and the frontal lobe works with the motor cortex to make precise movements. The motor cortex is really what controls all movement of your peripheral nervous system. All right, we got to talk about a case study with the frontal lobe, and this guy is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage in 1846 was a really well-respected, polite, well-liked, well-mannered railroad foreman who worked to clear paths for railroad tracks. So he was like the leader guy of the dudes that did the really heavy work in clearing paths to lay track for trains. There was an accident because they work with dynamite to like blow stuff up and get it out of the way, right? When working with dynamite, it exploded, and a steel rod that you see pictured here, he's holding it. Actually, his mouth was open. It went through the roof of his mouth, up through his cheek, behind his eye socket, destroying his eye, and out the top of his head, the frontal lobe. Whoa. So the steel rod entered his skull beneath his cheekbone, exited above his forehead, permanently damaging his frontal lobe. Now, we can't permanently damage someone's frontal lobe ethically in science just to see what happens. But this guy gave so much insight to the human race on what the frontal lobe does. He survived. He had no impairment to his speech, his motor functioning, or memory. None of it. But he had severe damage to the frontal lobe. So what happened? I'm going to ask you, what do you think happened? Go back to the last slide. Look back in your notes. What does the frontal lobe control? What did he then suck at? He was no longer very good at his job. And in fact, I think lost his job because the frontal lobe controls pre or future planning. So he couldn't get anywhere on time because he was really bad at future planning. His personality completely changed. He would just like totally go off on a tangent, off a handle, right? And like he would cuss and be really rude and say really nasty things to people. His personality really changed. He lost friends because of this, because he wasn't really a nice or well-liked man anymore. And so tons of things about him, his temperament, all of that changed, showing us how crucial the frontal lobe is in our personality. So like I said, at the back of that is the motor cortex, right? Largely responsible for those voluntary movements of parts of the body. So if parts of that motor cortex are stimulated, corresponding parts of the body will move. So if your right motor cortex is stimulated, let's say like right there, the body part that it controls right there on the left side of the body, because it switches, it goes the opposite, will move. That's crazy. Crazy town. Movements that are precise or really intricate and delicate are controlled by considerably larger portions of space in the motor cortex. I find that totally intriguing. And that's why I want to show you what is called a homunculus. If you went to YouTube and researched homunculus through on Big Bang Theory, there's a funny tidbit on there, but it's kind of inappropriate. But it's funny. So given the proportionality of body parts to space in each of our cortexes, both motor and sensory, a homunculus is what the body would look like if it were proportionate to that space taken up in the cortex. So you'll notice here in this image over off on the right in the blue here, it says motor. Think of your hands and how precise your hands can move. They can put on eyeliner and not poke out your eye. They can write letters that are like this small, right? So they have very fine, intricate movement. They take up a ton of space. Same with your mouth, so that you know that you're saying tomato and not tomato. It takes a very small, different movement to say the same word, right? Well, that then takes up more space in your motor cortex. All right, next let's talk about the parietal lobe. Okay, so we got frontal lobe. First headband is motor cortex. Then you have a second headband, which is your somatosensory cortex or sensory cortex, which is in, like on the crown of your head here, the parietal lobe. It controls function like body position, understanding where you are in space, understanding where your hand is in regard to your face or your elbow in regards to the desk. Spatial reasoning like touch, pressure, temperature, pain, and of course that somatosensory cortex. So this sensory cortex, first it's called somatosensory because it's of the body. Okay, so same with motor. It's movement and senses of your body, meaning not your eyes, not your ears. Yes, those are on your body, but it's skin or body feeling or movement. Eyes and ears are controlled elsewhere. So this image is actually an fMRI image that's enhanced of brain experiencing pain. And the green that you see there indicates sensory experience right where the sensory cortex is, right? And the red indicates emotional experience. So it's located at the front of the parietal lobe. It's like that second headband, if you were to have on two headbands, largely responsible for perceiving touch and pressure on parts of the body. And same as with the motor cortex, the sensory cortex, if it were to be stimulated in a certain spot, the corresponding body part, the person would feel something there. They would feel pressure to that specific part. Totally cool. And of course, same with the last homunculus, the more sensitive the area, like your fingertips, like your tongue and your lips, the more surface area of the cortex is dedicated to those spots. All right, the next one, and I'm putting my hair behind my ears, is your temporal lobe. Okay, it's kind of like that space just above your, and really behind your ears. They control functions like hearing with your primary auditory cortex. There is a cortex in there, but it's all about hearing. Hence why I put my hair behind my ears, because that's where your temporal lobe is, but also indicates its function. Storing long-term memories, speech, and language understanding. The occipital lobe is in the back, controls functions like all aspects of vision because it has a primary visual cortex in there. Each piece of the cortex actually corresponds to a particular place on your retina, just like the motor and sensory cortexes, receiving only information from that specific place, and then they're later put together to form a whole image. That's so complicated, but so cool that your brain can do that. Now let's talk about association areas. These are uncommitted areas of the brain, meaning they do not have anything to do with sensory or motor functioning. Okay? Our sensory or motor cortex, our occipital and temporal lobes have very specific sensory or motor functioning. But there's other areas that don't have those specific functions. They have higher order thinking functions. Those are our association areas. And there are two huge ones you need to know. Wernicke's is the first one. It's in the left temporal lobe, right? So only on the left hemisphere. And it's in the temporal lobe. I want you to think left, on the left side of your brain, language. It is responsible for language comprehension and expression. That's Wernicke's. Then Broca's area is also on the left, hence left language, but it's in the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for directing motor movement of your mouth involved in speech. Also motor movement in like your hands too, especially if you know sign language. Now, I got a big question for you, and I want you to do this in class, but definitely write it down first. Considering the specific function of both Wernicke's, language understanding and comprehension, and Broca's, physical formation and movement of speech, why do their locations make sense? Why does Broca's area in the frontal lobe make sense? And why does Wernicke's location in the temporal lobe make sense? Look at the functions of both of those lobes and then answer the question. This is a great video that I want you to look up from TED Ed. You could totally look it up on YouTube to watch about what goes on when Wernicke's or Broca's are broken or damaged. All right, now let's talk about the hemispheres of the brain because we have two, right? And they are roughly mirror images of each other. They function as two separate brains. You have two brains in your head. that only communicate with each other through what is the corpus callosum, through which all activity from one side is communicated with the other. So it works as one brain, but really you have two brains in there. I think that's incredible. The right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere. The left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere. So the peripheral nervous system, all your sensory and motor neurons, come up to the top of, like they go into your spine, come up to the top, and then they switch. Right? So it's right like below the brain stem that they make that switch. Pretty incredible. All right, let's talk about jobs of each of the hemispheres. We're going to start at the back of the brain because notice this pink part is the frontal lobe. So in the back, that's your occipital lobe, right? But that doesn't mean that all of these are like geographically located correctly on the brain in this image. So on the left hemisphere, it controls your ability to see words and letters, whereas on the right, it allows you to see geometric patterns, faces, and emotional expression, right? So emotional is really on that right side of the brain. Hearing, temporal lobe, right? Wernicke's is in the temporal lobe on the left, so it makes sense that the left hemisphere allows you to hear language sounds, whereas the right is non-language sounds and music, bodily expression of language. Memory, the left is verbal memory because of left language, right? And then right is nonverbal memory. Language itself is all on the right. So all on the left. Speech, grammar rules, reading, writing, arithmetic. But there is some involvement on the right because it's emotional tone. You kind of see a trend here, right? Emotion is on the right. And lastly, spatial ability. There is nothing about space on the left. It's only in the right with geometry, sense of direction, distance, mental rotation of shapes, and that you can take like your house and spin it around and like still see where things are going, or you can visually walk through your house, that kind of thing. That's your right hemisphere. All right, let's talk about brain plasticity. By the way, this image really shows you cerebrum versus cerebral cortex. Like this darker color, the brownish, that's the cerebral cortex. So think of like taking a tissue like this or a piece of paper and then crumbling it up. It still has an outer layer even though it goes into the grooves and such, right? That's the same as your brain. So let's talk about brain plasticity, also known as neuroplasticity. It's the brain's ability to continuously change throughout your life due to its use. This is a big takeaway here because what that means is that if you don't use it, you lose it. Like Spanish or some language you're learning in high school, yeah, that's going to go away soon if you don't use it. It's just the way it happens. So brain activity associated with a certain function can actually, and here's what's really cool about plasticity, it can actually be transferred to a different part of the brain, a different location in the brain, particularly if the original area becomes damaged. This is incredible. What this means is if you have damage, let's say to Wernicke's area in your temporal lobe, that means other areas around Wernicke's will start to take over that function for you, allowing you to still communicate and use language expression. Incredible. All right, split brain procedure is the next big one, and this one is rather complicated. We use a split brain procedure to better understand lateralization of the brain, meaning how certain functions are only in one hemisphere. And we learn from split brain patients. It gives us a big advantage. So to split the brain in a surgical procedure, because yes, that's done, what part of the brain would be severed? What part of the brain would be cut? There's a hint on the slide. I hope that you see it's the corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum is the only thing that allows the two hemispheres to talk to each other. So the surgery, the reason why they would even do this surgery, it allows the two hemispheres to be split from each other, which is only necessary, I'm pretty sure only necessary, in cases of severe epilepsy, right? It's a last resort, but some people actually need this done because their epilepsy is so severe. But there are side effects, right? They can go about their lives functioning as a normal human being. But there are side effects to observe in these patients that, again, helps us to understand those specializations of each hemisphere. This is a video I want you to YouTube and look up if you don't have these slides. Again, they're available on my TPT store. Here's the thing. It's really complicated to understand split brain patients. But here's what College Board and what you need to understand about split brain. It's all about knowing what each hemisphere, what each side of the brain can and can't do, particularly with language and speech, because that's a huge difference. But then it's also about knowing the hemispheres control the opposite sides of the body. So 2 big understandings: what each hemisphere can and can't do, and the fact that they control the opposite sides of the body. So let's look at an example. If Sally is a split brain patient, she sees a baseball in her right visual field, because this is kind of complicated, but each sides of your eye are controlled just like each side of your body. Kind of crazy. But let's say they isolate a baseball in her right visual field. Where does that information go to the brain? In her brain, where does that go? I hope you identify it goes to the left hemisphere because it's her right visual field. So therefore it goes to the left hemisphere. Remember, opposites in the spinal cord. Can she say that she saw the baseball? So now is where you need to think, okay, left hemisphere. Can the left hemisphere speak? Yes, it can. Because language is in the left hemisphere with Wernicke's and Broca's. Okay? Now, what if she holds a baseball in her left hand? Can she say, I'm holding a baseball? Why or why not? Well, the answer is no. Because the right brain, the right hemisphere received that info, and it does not have the ability to speak. Interesting. But if you told the left hand to then write what it is, if you told her to write what it is that she was holding, she could draw it. So her right hemisphere could express, I know what I was holding, I just can't say it. Crazy. All right, guys. I encourage you to rewind and rewatch some parts that are kind of tricky because this was a big one. But that wraps up part 2 of the brain. We now have 2 sets of notes to go in this unit because it's a big one. We're going to talk about psychoactive drugs and then sleep and dreams. So go ahead and click to watch those videos in the playlist, and I'll see you there.